Good afternoon, everyone. I hope you've all had something good to eat and to drink. We are slightly past our scheduled start time, so we will start. You will have noticed that we're having a slight technological issue. The technological issue, as I understand it, is that the projector in the middle doesn't like Hebrew characters. Therefore, we've taken a technological decision to put the lens cap on, so if anything falls onto you unexpectedly, that's what's happening. We hope that you can see. It's my great pleasure and privilege to introduce our next speaker, Dr. Emily Colgan from the Trinity Methodist Theological College. We've already encountered scripture during this conference. I'm hugely looking forward to hearing Emily talk to us now. She brings her specialist knowledge to bear, especially her understanding of the Hebrew Bible. Emily, you're to talk with us on reading the Bible as waters rise, ecological interpretation of the scripture. Thank you.
Thank you, Bishop. Well, kia ora mai tātou, e mihi nui ana kia koutou katoa. Greetings from Aotearoa. I've got no pockets. No problem. Okay. I want to begin today by acknowledging Archbishop Winston. I was a student in Matua Winston's postgrad class at the University of Auckland many years ago, and it was he who set me on this path of research in the area of Bible and climate change. So I will forever be indebted to you, Matua Winston, for your deep wisdom, your knowledge and your gentle encouragement. E mihi nunui kia koe, Matua, mo tēnei taonga. Kia ora. I'm going to begin with a quote from Thomas Berry, a Roman Catholic priest and eco-theologian. He said that the greatest failure of Christianity in the total course of its history is its inability to deal with the devastation of the planet. Now this is a big call, but I want you to keep it in the back of your mind as we talk today. Before we leap into reading the Bible from an ecological perspective, I want to give some background to this ecological approach. This background begins with an article published in 1967 by a scientist named Lynn White Jr., who argued that a causal relationship exists between Christianity and the contemporary ecological crisis. Among the accusations levelled against particularly Western Christianity in his paper is the charge that this is the most anthropocentric religion the world has ever seen. Grounded in the creation story of Genesis 1, Christianity, argues White, gives privilege to humans as the pinnacle of creation, thereby diminishing the value of the other-than-human community. In Genesis 1 we read, God blessed them, and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, and have dominion over the fish of the sea, the birds of the air, and every living thing that moves upon the earth. Not only does this ecological segregation establish humankind as master over the environment, White argues it also depicts as God's will the exploitation of nature to serve human interest. White suggests that it is this anthropocentric worldview that has enabled the emergence of scientific and technological ideologies which have had such a devastating impact on the environment. Modern Western science, he argues, was cast in a matrix of Christian theology. Our science and technology have grown out of Christian attitudes towards humanity's relation to nature. We are superior to nature, contemptuous of it, willing to use it for our slightest whim. And so he argues, Christianity bears a huge burden of guilt for the kind of behaviour in the world that has been so ecologically disastrous. The ecological crisis, he argues, is a religious crisis, as we heard from Bishop Mark this morning. But White doesn't stop there. What we do about ecology depends on our ideas of the human-nature relationship, he argues. More science and more technology, he suggests, are not going to get us out of the present ecological crisis until we find a new religion or rethink our old one. And so, in concluding his article, White insists that since the roots of the ecological crisis are largely religious, the remedy must also be essentially religious, whether we call it that or not. If, as White suggests, it's through Christian theology, biblical interpretation, that human beings have become alienated from the environment, then perhaps this same source may provide some motivation for the transformation of human attitudes towards our planet. Now, there are a number of issues, I think, with White's argument, but I've started with it for two reasons. First of all, White's paper is significant because it marks a point where biblical scholars, in the West at least, begin to take seriously the relationship between Bible and ecology. This is 1967. Some of us weren't born then. But the other reason that I'm starting with White is because he seems to suggest that our stories about who we are as humans, our theological anthropologies, are not really working for us anymore. He's arguing that we need a new story, or new stories, about our relationship to the world around us. And I think he might have a point. Because fast forward 50 years after this article was written, and scientific leaders continue to warn us that climate change is real and it's already causing irrevocable damage to the planet. In Aotearoa, and even more acutely in Oceania, we're seeing huge increases in extreme weather events. These images are from Aotearoa. We've seen flooding, 2016 in Edgecombe. Record-breaking storms. This was the Waikato River in the South Island, west coast of the South Island, March this year. Severe drought. This is in Canterbury, January 2018. Bushfires, the Port Hills and Christchurch, February 2017. And of course, rising sea levels and erosion. These images are all taken from Aotearoa in the last 3 years. This last image is of my grandparents' home in a place called Te Maika. The rising sea levels and erosion means that their home will likely be gone in about 10 years. That was taken a couple of years ago, actually. It's worse now. And this tragedy, as we know, has already happened to so many of our brothers and sisters in Oceania. I know here in Lincolnshire as well, you are experiencing similarly extreme weather events. We're also increasingly aware of the links between climate change and human initiatives, such as deforestation, fossil fuel emissions, pollution, overpopulation, the destruction of ecosystems, and of course the reduction of biodiversity. Yet despite climate change being acknowledged as among the most critical issues faced by the Earth community, this threat to the planet has failed to galvanise humanity, and questions remain as to whether the political will exists to address the situation quickly and effectively. Scientific fact alone, it seems, is not enough to counter what Thomas Berry calls the deep cultural pathology that enables humanity to cause such damage without thought of long-term consequence. These warnings, it seems, must also find a degree of coherence with the religious and philosophical foundations that underlie the way in which human communities perceive themselves and their relationship to the surrounding environment. So the situation is desperate, and I think we've kind of got a sense of that in the last day and a half. But I also think that there's room for hope. Many of us are wrestling with what it might mean to construct a faith-based response to the issue of climate crisis. How might we read the Bible with this particular issue in mind? And this has led to the emergence of ecological readings of Scripture. The reading strategy that I'm going to share with you today comes out of South Australia. It's about 20 years old now, and provides one way of reading the Bible in the context of ecological degradation. This reading strategy is unique in that it requires a radical reorientation to the biblical text, where Earth is placed at the centre of the interpretation and questions asked of its presence there. Now, just a quick note about terminology. I'm going to be speaking about Earth, but I also want to acknowledge the risk of kind of homogenizing this vast and complex phenomenon. So while it won't be possible to articulate kind of the incredible diversity of this realm, I'm using Earth to refer to the other than human. Mountains, air, trees, lakes, animals, land, birds, and of course, Moana. And humans are in there as well. But they often get mentioned separately. So, in ecological interpretation, Earth is not a theme for analysis. Earth is autonomous. It is an agent in its own right, a subject or a character within the text. This approach emphasizes reflection with Earth and attempts to perceive reality from Earth's perspective. Right from the outset, then, this interpretation is not value neutral or objective. This reading strategy establishes a moral stance that is at the centre of the interpretation. And this stance is informed by 6 eco-justice principles outlined by the Earth Bible team. And these principles were created in dialogue with a number of scientists working in biology and ecology and other areas. I'm going to go through these very briefly because they're quite important. First of all, the principle of intrinsic worth. This principle argues that Earth and its complex communities of ecological systems have value in themselves, not because they're useful to humanity. So, for example, other than human characters are understood as agents with their own individual integrity, who respond obediently to God and who are valued by God. What if, for example, using the passage that you talked about, Bishop Mike, this morning, what if we understood the wind and the waters in the story of the synoptic accounts of Jesus calming the storm? What if we understood the wind and waters to be living characters in that text? The story is no longer just about the disciples' encounter with Jesus. Then we see the principle of interconnectedness. And this principle says each species and each member of each species is connected by complex webs of interrelationships. And this, of course, includes humanity. As Philip Hefner says, our kinship with nature is not a matter of our preference, nor is it an issue that calls for our acquiescence. It simply is. We'll pick up on this a bit later. The next principle is that of voice. And this principle says that Earth is a living entity capable of raising its voice in celebration and against injustice. So, for example, Earth languishes or trembles in fear in the prophets. Earth quakes in response to the resurrection in Matthew 28. So this principle is committed to hearing the voices of Earth, even if Earth doesn't use the language of human communication in the text. Next, we have the principle of purpose. And for a long time, Earth's purpose was to serve humanity. But this principle affirms that Earth is a complex of interacting ecosystems that function according to an inbuilt design or purpose. We might recall Job, chapters 38 to 40, where we see creatures living according to their own purposes, quite independent of humanity. Next is the principle of mutual custodianship. And this principle is meant to reflect the role of human beings in the Earth community. It affirms the role of humanity as integral members of the Earth community who have a responsibility to act with mutuality and respect. Now, just to be clear, this principle is not about stewardship. An ecological perspective would argue that stewardship still retains a hierarchical model, which is problematic because it still assumes that humans are creatures of a different and superior order designed by God to rule over Earth. It's more, this idea is more like the idea of, in Māori it's kaitiakitanga, which is kind of more like guardianship. And finally, the principle of resistance. This affirms that in the struggle for justice, Earth is not necessarily a helpless victim, but one who is oppressed and who finds ways to survive and resist its oppressors. So, for example, Earth mourns to God in Jeremiah 4. Earth vomits the people out when they pollute in Leviticus 18. Bearing these principles in mind, an ecological interpretation then uses a three-step process to interpret a biblical text: suspicion, identification, and retrieval. So to begin, when approaching a text that relates to Earth, we may suspect that the history of interpretation has been anthropocentric, regarding Earth as inferior. Biblical interpretation has primarily been interested in the relationship between God and humanity. And so we ask, where is the Earth in this text? How do other characters engage with Earth in this text? Are there texts where the voices of Earth and the Earth community are present but have been ignored because of the mindset of interpreters? The next step is that of identification. And this step is about coming to terms with one's deep ecological connections, where an interpreter repositions themselves as part of the Earth community. Read from the perspective of an interconnected member of this community, a new level of sensitivity emerges, where we're sensitive to the experiences of Earth in the text. So this stage is about standing in solidarity with Earth and becoming an advocate for Earth as a character in the text. And so we ask, how might Earth experience the events described in a particular passage? The final task acknowledges that the Earth is already speaking and acting in a text. And so this step is about hearing and learning from Earth as a character communicating its story. This voice need not correspond to the language of words associated with human voices. But we ask, how might we retrieve the experience of Earth that has been suffocated by human readers who focus on human interests? And so this step involves articulating this communication. So, how might we go about doing an ecological reading of a biblical text? I want to return to this idea that traditional theological anthropology, stories about who we are, don't really work in the current context of climate crisis, and that we need new stories about who we are. And I want to offer two ecological readings. The first is relatively simple, the second is relatively complex. But I'm hoping that they might demonstrate the way these texts might contribute to a new collective self-understanding. So for the first interpretation, I want to relook at Genesis 1, which White argued has played such an important role in the Christian narrative about who we are in the world. Initially, at least in this text, Earth is a partner in the creation process. It is the source of living things. Earth's soil brings forth all kinds of vegetation. Animals appear from the ground, in verses 11, 12, and 24. Moana brings forth life in the oceans, in verse 20. All creatures have a common kinship that derives from earth. And God sees that it is good. God affirms, God values, and God celebrates the birth of earth. But in verses 26 to 28, we see that humans are not connected to this existing order. They don't emerge like other living creatures. Humans are not part of the earth in any way. Humans are made in the image of God and are given the mandate to dominate, fill, and subdue the earth. Now, the Hebrew term radah is what kings and taskmasters do in the Hebrew Bible. They dominate their subjects and their enemies. We've taken the mandate to fill the earth very literally, I think, as well. The Hebrew term kabash, to subdue, is elsewhere used to mean crush underfoot, to subjugate, and even to rape a woman in Esther and Nehemiah. These are words that denote violence. The relationship between humanity and earth in this narrative is characterized by violence. There's also a profound difference between humans and the rest of creation here. This story of who we are is disconnected from the story of plants and animals and oceans. It's removed from the grand context of the cosmos, the planets, the stars, and space. So is there another alternative narrative which might contribute to the creation of a new story? And if we just turn up Bible pages, we find Genesis 2. And typically, in this text, we see the main characters as God, the man, the woman, and perhaps the snake. But what about the Adamah, the earth? Here we learn, in Genesis 2, that there is no vegetation on earth because there is no one to serve Adamah and nurture her. So God takes some soil from Adamah and molds it into a figure called Adam, a human being. You note, of course, the linguistic connection between the Adamah and the Adam. Human beings were created, in this text, from earth, for earth. God gives the human the task of completing that which is missing at the beginning of the story. The human has the task of greening Adamah. In verse 15 we read, "Then the Lord God took the man, put him in the Garden of Eden, to serve and preserve it." Earth then helps to create the animals and birds, and there's a kinship between these creatures and the human. Earth is their common ancestor. Here the role of the human being is to serve and preserve Adamah. The Hebrew term abad is often translated in our Bibles, English Bibles, as till. but it literally means to serve. Serving is what people did when they devoted their attention to a particular person or task. So members of the court served the king, priests and worshippers served their God in the temple. Within Genesis 2 then, humanity is part of a single unfolding reality. Humanity is no longer separate from Earth. There is a continuity of life. And as I understand it, this story links far more closely with scientific understandings of the human place within the cosmos. So that's the first interpretation, ecological interpretation. The second ecological interpretation, it's going to get a bit dense, but stick with me. We're going to look at this text from Jeremiah. It's a lesser known text, Jeremiah 31 verses 35 to 37. I'm going to go quite deep. This passage relates not only to Earth but to the entire cosmos. And I guess I kind of want to just show you what can be done with a text from an ecological perspective. I'm going to read it to you because I'm not sure that everyone's familiar with this text. Thus says the Lord, who gives the sun for light by day, and the fixed order of the moon and the stars for light by night. Who stirs up the sea so that its waves roar? The Lord of hosts is his name. If this fixed order were ever to cease from my presence, says the Lord, then also the offspring of Israel would cease to be a nation before me forever. Thus says the Lord, if the heavens above can be measured, and the foundations of the earth below can be explored, then I will reject all the offspring of Israel because of all they have done, says the Lord. Now you might be thinking, where is she going to go with this? Sit back. So, how might we make sense of these verses from an ecological perspective? The interaction between God and cosmos in verse 35 is initially seen at a structural level, as verbs of action and encounter are seen at the centre of the verse. You can hopefully see it there. The verbs to give and to stir have traditionally been translated to support interpretations which suggest a one-way relationship between God as maker or designer and the other than human realm, that which has been made or designed. Typical translations of the verb natan, to give, range from fixed and established to appoints and commands. Translations which imply the authoritative action of a deity who is outside the creative process being described. In my interpretation, though, I've chosen to nuance the literal meaning of natan, using instead the verb to enable. Now this translation makes explicit the suggestion, I think implied in the verb to give, of performative action that is non-hierarchical and yet still facilitates action. Something of this nuanced meaning is seen in the Hebrew, where the participial form of this verb shows us that the divine activity here is both interactive and ongoing. So rather than being reduced to a set of events that happened in some distant past, enacted by an all-controlling deity, God's creative activity, God's enabling, is seen here as a continuous engagement with the cosmic order. Existence is made possible through the dynamic interrelationship between God and cosmos. But this creative agency is not restricted to the divine figure alone. God's enabling results in the action of the celestial beings themselves, as the sun, the moon, and the stars respond to the divine encounter by providing light for the day and the night, respectively. Here, the divine enabling appears to be this continuous call into newness of being, to which the cosmic elements are invited to respond. This reading implies an interdependent relationship between characters whose interactive agency makes them co-equal subjects in their own right. Just as the cosmic beings depend upon God's empowerment, so too does God depend on the response of the cosmos, for such empowerment is futile without responding action. In other words, just as the sun is dependent upon God's enabling activity, so too is God dependent upon the sun's response in providing light. The relationship here is an ongoing and dynamic encounter between God and cosmos. From the celestial realm, our eyes are drawn down into the surging domain of Moana in verse 35b. The evocative imagery here depicts God stirring up the sea so that its waves roar. Once again, the participial form of the verb ragar, to stir up, suggests that the divine interaction with Moana is an ongoing encounter. Again, also the sea responds to God's stirring, in this case, through the roaring of its waves. Some scholars suggest that this interaction between God and Moana should be read through the warrior traditions of neighbouring ancient Near Eastern cultures, and thus understood as an allusion to the divine battle with the sea. Against this backdrop, the Moana is seen as an oceanic wilderness, a hostile power that threatens the cosmic order. Standing in combative opposition to this unruly force, God is presented as the conqueror of chaos, whose engagement with Moana demonstrates the divine control over the powers present in the realm of this vast unknown. But I want to reread this so-called antagonistic relationship between God and Moana and challenge the rhetoric of mastery and subjugation, which inevitably results from these kinds of interpretations. Read against the background set out by traditional interpretations, God's stirring here appears menacing and provocative, while the roaring of the sea is seen as a hostile response to such goading. But the intent behind these verbs changes dramatically when they're read through some of the Bible's more positive oceanic traditions, like Psalm 96, like Isaiah 42, where the sea's thunderous roar bespeaks pleasure and celebration. If, in line with these traditions, the sea's utterance is understood as an answering roar of spontaneous delight, then God's instigative stirring, which elicits such a response, can be interpreted as a playful gesture of joy-filled fun. Far from being an angry altercation, this interaction is conceived as light-hearted and amiable. In playing with Moana, God demonstrates delight in the ocean, taking pleasure in its wild and tempestuous character. Through such enjoyment, God implicitly acknowledges and respects the sea's inherent subjectivity. For, as Joseph Sittler says, to enjoy means to let a thing be itself and rejoice in it. Such interaction seen here seems to depict relationship beyond hierarchy. The playful reciprocity between God and Moana seems to resist domination and manipulation. Mutual enjoyment thus contributes to an alternative vision of relationship in its affirmation of non-hierarchical interconnectivity. In verse 35 then, God's relationship to the cosmos is a continuous moment-by-moment connection, which enlivens and empowers all matter. Here we see an affirmation of the subjectivity, the agency of both God and cosmos. God's engagement with the cosmos here allows for individuality without relinquishing interconnectivity. Reality, as it is seen in this verse, is fundamentally, joyfully, and non-hierarchically relational. And such relationality seems to be characterized by interdependence, mutual empowerment, and the sincere enjoyment of an other. This is an image of interaction that both respects and allows space for the creative agency of life in all its forms, alien and threatening as they may seem to us, without totalizing or profiting from them. This imagery asserts that relationship is a dynamic process that is continually constructed through negotiation in the form of invitation and response. Bearing in mind this image of relationality, I'm going to turn now to look at the interaction between humanity and that which is other than human in verse 37. Sorry, I told you it got a bit dense. Oh, sorry, that was the last slide. Okay. So the final verse in this passage deals with the heavens above and the earth below. Rhetorically speaking, verse 37 employs what's called a protasis apodosis sequence, in which an impossible or unthinkable scenario negatively expresses an assurance. So here, it's the impossibility of the heavens and the earth being measured or explored that underlines the equally inconceivable rejection of Israel's descendants. Now, interpretive investigations into this text tend to focus upon Israel's permanence as the people of God. But in this analysis, I want to focus on the divine assertion, the divine claim, that earth cannot be explored, and consider the ecological implications that it might emerge from such a claim. To the contemporary reader, the text's claim that the earth is unexplorable seems antiquated, reflective of an obsolete ancient worldview. Beneath the literal inaccuracy of the divine claim, however, lies an awareness of earth as immeasurably vast and fundamentally unknowable. In its extraordinary complexity, the earth is ultimately beyond human comprehension. God's assertion in this verse identifies earth as mystery. Here, the elusive character of earth is not limited to that which is not yet known. Rather, unknowability is constitutive of earth itself. Mystery, it seems, does not exclusively belong to God, but to earth also. Such identification is insufficient by itself, though, so I want to examine the earth's mysterious or unknowable character in the broader context of relationship. The idea of earth as unknowable to humanity counters anthropocentric models of interaction with the environment, which have been so often based upon conquest, domestication, and exploitation. God declares that for humanity to perceive earth is both to know it and not to know it. Comprehension cannot be comprehensive. To encounter earth is thus to encounter mystery, to be faced with the limits of human knowledge before such mystery. In the same way that the unknowability of God shapes the human-divine relationship, so earth's unknowability will have implications for the ways in which humanity relates to their surroundings. Contemplating the vast and unknowable character of earth leads to an overwhelming sense of wonder and awe. Like Job, who is rendered speechless when confronted by the divine mystery, so humanity responds here with silence when presented with the unfathomable mystery of earth. Such silence, though, is not disinterested, it's not fearful, but nuanced by the context of awe and wonder. It reflects an attitude of reverence and gentle receptivity towards Earth. It is in this silence that humanity is able to reflect upon its own insignificance in the face of this immeasurable and inconceivably complex other. Acknowledgement of this dynamic results in an attitude of humility and self-restraint that recognizes and respects Earth in itself, for itself. At the heart of this model of relationship, then, lies the broad and interrelated categories of mystery, awe, silence, and humility. Almost there. So we're going to move on now to the only remaining verse left in this passage. Like its succeeding verse, Jeremiah 31, verse 36, employs that protasis apodosis motif, and is also commonly interpreted as a divine guarantee of Israel's permanence. As the cosmic order will never cease, so also shall Israel never cease to be a nation before God. Reading ecologically, I've chosen to nuance this dependability by taking this sequence at face value as a statement of cause and effect. If the cosmos was to cease from existing, then so too would the seed of Israel come to an end. And here I'm following a biblical scholar, Jack Lunsbaum, who suggests that the reference to seed in this verse should be understood in the broader sense as pertaining to the seed of every living entity on earth. From an ecological perspective then, God's claim here is nothing short of an unqualified affirmation of the interconnected and interdependent relationship that exists between God, cosmos, and life on earth. The divinely enabled cosmos, identified in verse 35, makes possible the existence of earth and all its inhabitants. In its cosmic perspective, verse 36 imagines reality as a unified, integrated, and meaningful whole, which is characterized by the diversity of its member parts. This image assumes an infinite multiplicity of relationships, which form a complex web of dynamic and continuous connection events. Everything that exists is interrelated. Relationality here is not incidental or additional to any given entity, but rather relationality constitutes the very essence of all that is. With the recognition of this capacity for relationship comes the acknowledgement that all modes of beings are subjects and agents of influence in their own right, who are themselves vulnerable to the influence of others. In the image of reality depicted in this verse, human beings are not distinguished or separated from this cosmic ecosystem. We exist as individuals who are related intrinsically and inescapably to all others in this interconnected community. The interconnectedness observed in verse 36 builds upon the image of interdependence that we saw in verse 35. But here, all individual entities rely on each other for their existence. As the sun, the moon, the stars depend upon the divine lure, calling them into being, so the seed, that is every living entity, is dependent upon the presence of this fixed order for its existence. Such dependence is not exclusive, though, for reliance on this fixed order is, by extension, reliance on God's lure. Like the multiple nature of relationality, interdependence is also multi-layered and infinitely diverse. Directly or indirectly, in this text, all entities depend simultaneously both on the divine empowerment and on the myriad of other entities that have responded to that empowerment in the past. To exist within this cosmic reality is thus to be utterly dependent upon others, although this dependence is not unilateral. In the same way that the interdependent relationship between God and the cosmic elements took the form of invitation and reply, so the dependence depicted here in verse 36 also requires a response. If the fixed order enables the seed, living entities, of Israel to be a nation, then the response is ongoing existence. The combination of this fixed order and the lure of God thus enables these entities to fully become themselves and to participate in the interdependent whole as beings who continue to depend upon others and upon whom others depend. Although this perspective on relationality is lamentably fleeting, I believe it provides a significant glimpse into a symbolic order which has the capacity to contribute positively to the formation of a contemporary ecological sensibility. Central to the depiction of relationality here is the image of multiple and non-hierarchical interdependent relationships among beings that exist individually as part of a vast and complex whole. Indeed, the enabling presence of God within all bodies, from the sun and the sea to the land and its inhabitants, affirms the radical integration of all, as well as emphasizing the unity of each entity with all others. This text simultaneously affirms the distinction of each entity from all others. Each individual being has its own independent value and integrity within this interdependent reality. This recognition in turn necessitates the acknowledgement of all beings as subjects in their own right. Within this relational context, engagement is based upon a common understanding of the autonomy, agency, and inherent worth of the other. While the brevity of this passage limits the amount of detail concerning the relational obligations within this idea of existence, the ramifications of the reality imagined here reverberate beyond the world of the text. Recognition of the cosmic interdependence depicted here carries with it strong ethical dimensions. To perceive the self as one who is dependent upon others, and upon whom others depend, requires broadening one's gaze to include the consideration of all living entities. It is to celebrate and enjoy the presence of otherness, while working to ensure that this otherness, this mystery, is protected. To live appropriately within this whole is thus a continuous negotiation, as individual interests are subordinated to the pragmatic imperative of interdependence and the flourishing of all. So finally, the images drawn from the Genesis narrative and the Jeremiah text do not pretend to provide solutions to the intricate and complex issues specific to the climate crisis. Rather, these biblical visions provide faith communities with a foundation for reconceiving the relationship between God, earth, and humanity, from which these communities might then begin to address the multiplicity of issues related to the crisis. in emphasizing interdependence and the subjectivity of all. These texts provide an alternative to the anthropocentric outlook, which is often implicit in our liturgies, our worship, and our ideas about justice and morality. Set alongside the ever-increasing scientific discoveries that point towards interdependence, I believe these texts have the potential to act as powerful resources for faith communities in the ongoing endeavour to alleviate environmental degradation. Thank you.
Emily, thank you so much. You've opened up perspectives on two really important passages for us, and I know that there's going to be good conversation in the next few minutes. I'm not a Hebraist, so I found, as you hinted that I might, the Jeremiah very interesting and rather challenging. But I think, yes, tough, but the Genesis is too, as well. And I'm profoundly grateful to you also for the light that you have shown on this. Creation narratives are close to my heart. Every day as I get about my business in the diocese, I look at the level of the water in the rivers and the drains. This is something I've learned to do over the last 4 years. It's become part of me. And actually also, every day as I get about my business in the diocese, I think, well, how might other people's readings of the creation narratives affect the way that they might see me as a Christian, as part of the LGBT community, and alarmingly to some, as a bishop. How we read Scripture matters. So, thank you. Who would like to begin? Hands.
I was hoping you guys would all just be like, that was time for a nap.
I see hands. Sorry.
Everyone's asleep.
No naps. That was so exciting. Hooray. Can we give her another round?
No.
Exciting because it's a liberating way of looking at the scriptures. I wonder if you would go back for me to the Genesis narrative and see how you consider the way the first narrative, chapter 1, I wonder if it's a liberating thing that the sixth day contains the creation of humanity along with other creatures. And so I wonder about that. In other words, they're not completely independent.
No.
And I wonder what you think about that. Does it imply the mutual custodianship, perhaps?
Right. Yeah, and I think you could definitely draw those ideas out of that text, particularly if you're looking at it from an ecological perspective.
Yeah.
I think one of the problems is that our history of interpretation has not looked at the text like that, and so we've kind of ended up with these
extracting it.
Yeah. So yes, and this is kind of, for me, one of the beauty and most exciting thing about biblical interpretation is that multiplicity of readings. And it's not to say that the Genesis 1 narrative is completely problematic and we need to write it off completely, because it's not. It's a beautiful, it's one of my favourite pieces of poetry. And read from say for example, from a feminist perspective, it's a very, very liberating text.
Yeah.
But I think it's important to acknowledge the problematic nature of what we have and what we've received from our history of interpretation.
Yeah.
But I think that's also a really important kind of insight, is to say, human beings they're not given a separate day to themselves.
Yeah.
They are created differently, but they are still created on the same day as these other.
Yeah, our birthday is the same day as all.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And with that, and then I'll yield this. In the same way you just said in terms of looking at the way it's edited and put together, if we were less extractive and maybe keeping those two narratives together, 1 and 2, problematizes and also makes gentler and more interesting.
Yeah.
The first narrative.
You're absolutely right. It does problematize, but it also gives, I think, far greater scope, and it gives this kind of sense of needing to hold in tension a whole lot of different perspectives.
Yeah, here's one story. Let's start over, but we're holding both of them.
Yeah, and they're both very, very important, and hold deep, profound truth.
You mentioned Lynn White, who blamed Christianity for the ecological crisis, but it's certainly not the only one. We call Bultmann with this concept of disenchantment of the world, which is a kind of free license to exploit the world. But on the other hand, I think the important question today is not who is guilty, but who can help us to solve the problem. So I was glad to hear that you said the ecological crisis is a religious crisis, but the answer also needs to be religious.
Yeah, and I think there's a beautiful quote I really like by Rosemary Redford-Ruther, who says, there's, I don't even know the numbers anymore, 2.2 billion Christians in the world. If we can convince Christians, those 2.2 billion people, that an ecological consciousness grows out of our own soil, then maybe we can effect some kind of transformation. And on that kind of scale, as we've talked about in a number of conversations this morning, actually that kind of scale is going to produce change. And so, I think there are problems, but I think there's also potential.
Hello, I just wanted to pick up on on Genesis 1 that you talked about the sort of issues of interpretation there, and you contrasted. You talked about the ruling and subduing and dominion. So this is what kings do, and think the bad ways in which kings do rule and have dominion and subdue. But isn't the problem with our interpretation of Genesis 1 is that we look at the bad way in which people rule, the bad way in which people have dominion, and therefore saying ruling and having dominion are wrong. Rather, isn't the problem that we do have dominion over the earth, but we don't do it properly, we don't do it right?
Right. Yes, and I think one of the things that a lot of ecological theologians and biblical scholars kind of want to move away from is that kind of hierarchical model of thinking, because it has historically been quite problematic, which is why that, is it the third or fourth principle, that idea of mutual custodianship tries to shift that a little bit and to say, rather than seeing ourselves as superior beings who have control over and this kind of mandate to dominate, what if we saw ourselves as being mutual custodians, which doesn't deny the power of human beings, because we do have a lot of power to
if I grow vegetables in my garden, I'm subduing the garden.
Right. I think it's to nuance that, and to maybe shift it and to look at it in a slightly different light, in order to kind of shift our thinking from a hierarchical model to a more kind of
so maybe the
kinship
shift is
based.
not away from dominion, but that is the correct way of having dominion.
I mean, if you want to stick with that word dominion, but reinterpret it, sure.
Somewhere over there. Oh, hang on. I'll make my way over. No, I'll work that way across. I will get to you.
Hello, thank you. I was absolutely fascinated by your references to Jeremiah 4 and Leviticus 18. It's not something that Christians normally like to dwell upon. The earth shall vomit you out. And it reminded me, please don't YouTube this, it reminded me of the American comedian George Colgan, who does a set which he says, what is the purpose of human life? It's so that the earth can produce plastic. The earth can't produce plastic, it needed humans to do it, and once we've been vomiting out plastic, the earth has won. Now that's that comedic, although there's something else, but that comedic side of it I think is really fascinating because you've personified the earth as a character in the text, and I'm really excited by that because the earth is a living thing, a living, breathing thing. Will God use the earth the way that Leviticus says it will? What's your view on the punishment of humanity?
I'm not
by
God,
nature?
I don't know.
That's a big question.
You're asking me to speak on behalf. I don't feel comfortable speaking on behalf. I think, to kind of pick up on that, I think for me, one of the things, I've been doing kind of ecological interpretation since maybe 2004 or 5, and so it's become a lens through which I kind of can't help but read the biblical text. But the more you read through that lens, the more you see that the earth is just so utterly present. Particularly in the Hebrew Bible, but also in the New Testament, it's just everywhere. And once you start looking for it, you can't not see it. And once you start thinking about the earth in the text, you can't not see the earth as character in the text. And the central role that earth plays in so much of our sacred story. But I don't, in response to the second part of your question, I don't know. I'm not a theologian, I'm a biblical scholar. I don't have to answer theological questions.
Thank you.
Thank you. Lovely in the sense of a filled form. Some comments that I hope will be helpful for you and the audience for focus. Part of the problem, I think, is the picking and choosing of Bible verses. And particularly what I want you to respond to is, rather than using the lens that Jesus and the Gospels give in how we understand life, you didn't really sort of talk about what Jesus saying. So to give an example, I'm concerned Jesus never is called that individuals should accumulate private wealth. Arguably, he's critical of prosperity theology in that sort of sense. And sort of picking up on this Bruce's Caroline Merchant sort of unpicks elements of that. And she points to Francis Bacon and others, there's a lot of similar authors in research at that. Key point that I wanted to get to is Francis Bacon, about 500 years ago, was synthesising currents that were happening in society. And I don't think 500 years ago is necessarily incidental. So the last is this thought, well, how would Jesus do this ecological interpretation?
How did Jesus do it? Again, I feel I'm asked to respond on behalf of someone I feel unqualified to speak on behalf of. I don't know. Is the answer to that? I don't know how Jesus would respond to these. Read ecological. We don't have the evidence in the Gospels, right? But certainly we have evidence. I think that Jesus had a deep sense of connection to the earth, and had a sensitivity to the earth. And certainly, as I alluded to before, the earth seems to have responded and resonated with Jesus. But I don't think I can answer the question how would Jesus have read Scripture ecologically, because I don't know.
Jesus wrote once in the Quran.
Right, yeah.
Just a thought.
Thank you. Christine Jack from Leeds, in fact. I too have been reading the Bible ecologically since about 2004, off and on. And I'm really enjoying seeing how it's developed over the years as we've gone along. One thing I'd like to go back to, which you talked about, used the Hebrew a lot, yes, and language and interpretation. I'm not a linguist at all, but I am interested in language and language trees and language families. And I seem to remember sort of reading about Hebrew itself. It was seen as one of the early characters, yes, and that people saw it as a living thing.
Yes, yes.
Yeah, that's what I was wondering. If you didn't actually say that, and I'm just wondering if you were drawing on that tradition of seeing the characters, which comes right from the beginning of the Hebrew, as living things.
Right.
And how wonderful it is to draw, in fact, going right through to the Logos, isn't it?
Yes.
How you can really draw on that idea of language as a living thing to develop with our ecological perspective today.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I mean, well, I haven't used that for what I've shared with you today, but certainly there's a lot of research and kind of exploration in this idea of the materiality of the text, both as a physical document, which is, you know, made from paper and earth elements, or you know, on your iPhone, which is again made from earth elements. But absolutely, as living and breathing, and for me, there's something. So I mean, this is why I do what I do, because the Bible it's an ancient document, but it's a living document, and that's, you know, it is very old, and it's something that we're trying to kind of negotiate with and understand. But in that sense, the words and the letters and the ideas kind of go beyond the page. And are very, very powerful, and in that sense, it's profoundly living, and has such an impact and a potential to create ideas and realities, and yeah. So no.
Thank you.
Just thinking back to how you refer to this kind of mutual custodianship between humans and the planet, I want to kind of draw a link back to Bishop Ambros's mentioning of the Gaia hypothesis, and this idea that the planet is a kind of self-balancing system. So, to kind of wax a little bit apocalyptic, is there any allusion in the Bible of the Earth basically correcting itself and correcting the human influence? So for instance, as we're a natural product of the Earth, everything we do is itself a natural process.
Right.
Does the Earth then correct the imbalance that we then cause?
Well, I mean, as I kind of talked a little bit about in the Levitical text, and this idea of the Earth vomiting out inhabitants that have kind of transgressed, or maybe in that sense there is this kind of balancing that's going on. Certainly, particularly in the prophets, Earth is very much part of the putting right, or the attempt to put right the relationships that are going on between Earth and God and creation. So yeah, I do think I have made that link with the Gaia connection, but I do think that there are examples of the Earth being part of that process. Yeah.
Last and very short. That's okay.
Yeah.
Thank you, Emily. That was really stimulating. And I've just spent the last week on the island of Iona, immersed in Celtic spirituality. So my question to you is the kind of contribution of indigenous theologies to this understanding of interdependence.
Oh right, okay, yeah. To be honest, I think there could be more engagement between indigenous theologies and biblical theological ideas around interdependence, because there's a lot there, and I kind of alluded to the idea of kaitiakitanga, which is a concept within Mātauranga Māori, But I think there's a lot of space, and where for Indigenous scholars to kind of engage with that conversation, because it's so important. And yeah.
Emily, thank you so much.
Thank you.